Moving into the neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where James and his son, Aiden, could finally have some peace. After years of struggling with city living, dealing with stairs, inaccessible buildings, and constant logistical nightmares, this suburban home seemed perfect. It had a wide driveway to accommodate their wheelchair-accessible van, a spacious backyard where Aiden could enjoy the fresh air, and most importantly, a supportive environment, or so James thought. But within days of moving in, a woman introduced herself in a way that sent an immediate chill down James' spine. She was the self-appointed authority of the neighborhood, a woman who carried herself with an air of superiority, always holding a clipboard and wearing a fake, tight-lipped smile. "I'm Karen," she had said, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. She immediately pointed out how their wheelchair ramp was not in line with community aesthetics, how their van took up too much driveway space, and how it would be best for everyone if they didn't park it where people could see it. James, at first, assumed she was just another nosy neighbor, someone with too much time on their hands. But he quickly learned that Karen was the head of the HOA, and she wasn't just nosy, she was a tyrant. Within a week, the notices started arriving. Violation letters citing the ramp as an unauthorized modification were left on their door. A warning about their van being unsightly came next. Then came the HOA fines, ridiculous charges for supposed infractions like cluttering the sidewalk when Aiden's wheelchair momentarily sat outside while James helped him into the house. Every time James stepped outside, Karen seemed to be watching. She made little comments whenever she saw them, snide remarks about how the neighborhood had a certain image and how they were drawing attention to themselves. It wasn't just passive aggression. It was calculated. She even whispered to other neighbors, turning their presence into an unwanted controversy. Some neighbors were sympathetic, quietly apologizing for Karen's behavior, while others nodded along with her, unwilling to risk her wrath. One evening, James caught her standing on the edge of his lawn, hands on her hips, glaring at the ramp. He stepped outside and asked if there was a problem. Karen pursed her lips. It really is an eyesore," she said. "And I checked with the HOA regulations. This sort of thing requires approval." James clenched his jaw. "It's a necessity for my son." Karen didn't care. "There are rules," she snapped, her tone sharp and condescending. "If we start making exceptions, everyone will want to break the rules. Next thing you know, the neighborhood will look like a disaster." James wanted to argue, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Karen wasn't interested in logic or empathy. She wanted control. Things escalated when Karen started sending official HOA warnings. She fined James hundreds of dollars for the ramp. She claimed Aiden's wheelchair blocked the sidewalk whenever they paused to get into their van. She sent emails, texts, even left voicemails demanding that James comply or face further action. But James wasn't going to back down. He had fought too hard to give his son a good life to let some power-hungry woman bully them out of their home. The final straw came when James caught her taking pictures of their house, their car, and even Aiden. Furious, he confronted her. "Why are you taking pictures of my child?" he demanded. Karen didn't even flinch. "For documentation," she said coldly. "To show the HOA board that your situation isn't in line with the community's standards." James was done being polite. He called a lawyer, prepared to fight the fines, and even reached out to other neighbors who had been targeted by Karen's absurd HOA rules. Some were afraid to speak up, but others were willing to help. Still, Karen wasn't backing down. She doubled her efforts, even trying to get the city involved, falsely claiming that their modifications were a safety hazard. Then, in a final, desperate move, she announced that she was going to petition to have James and Aiden removed from the neighborhood altogether. "If you don't want to live by the rules," she sneered, "then maybe you should find a place that caters to your kind." That was it. James knew this wasn't just about rules or regulations. Karen wanted them gone because she didn't want to see them. She didn't want a wheelchair in her picture-perfect world. She was determined to make their lives miserable until they left. But James had no intention of leaving. He was ready for a fight. It was supposed to be a simple community gathering at the neighborhood park, a weekend event where residents could mingle, kids could play, and the HOA could show off how perfect their little slice of suburbia was. James hadn't originally planned on going, but Aiden had been excited about the idea of getting out, seeing the park, and, most importantly, being around other kids. The isolation had been wearing on him lately. Between Karen's harassment and the growing tension in the neighborhood, James had started keeping to himself, but he didn't want Aiden to feel like an outcast. So, despite his reservations, he packed up his son's wheelchair, drove down to the park, and hoped for a peaceful afternoon. That hope, however, was short-lived. The moment they arrived, James noticed Karen. She was standing near the gazebo, surrounded by a small group of people. Some HOA board members, some loyal followers who thrived on gossip and petty drama. The second she spotted them, her expression twisted in annoyance, as if their mere presence was an act of defiance. James could already see her whispering to her group, her eyes narrowing. Aiden, completely unaware of the brewing storm, was excited. He pointed toward the open grass near the playground, where a few kids were playing soccer. "Can we go over there, Dad?" he asked eagerly. James smiled, nodding. "Of course, bud." They made their way over, James pushing Aiden's wheelchair along the paved path toward the open area. A few of the kids glanced at Aiden, some curious, some smiling. A few parents gave polite nods, though some hesitated, looking unsure, as if they were wondering whether or not Aiden belonged. James ignored it. He had seen those kinds of looks before. People who didn't outright say anything, but their faces said everything. But Aiden didn't notice. He was just happy to be outside, in the sun, watching other kids have fun. Then Karen arrived. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she marched toward them, her usual expression of self-importance on full display. James tensed immediately. He could already see where this was going. "Excuse me," Karen said, stopping in front of them with her arms crossed. "I need to ask you something." James took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. "What is it now, Karen?" She gave him a thin-lipped smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I wasn't informed that you would be attending this event." James frowned. "I wasn't aware I needed permission." Karen sighed dramatically, shaking her head as if he were being unreasonable. "It's just that this is a family-friendly gathering. We have a certain level of decorum here, and..." She hesitated, her eyes flicking down to Aiden's wheelchair. "Well, I just think it might be best if you didn't disrupt things." James felt his blood pressure spike. "Disrupt things?" he repeated, his voice dangerously low. Karen put on her best fake sympathetic expression. "You know what I mean," she said, tilting her head. "It's not exactly convenient. We have kids running around, people walking, and that thing is just in the way." James clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. "That thing is my son's wheelchair," he snapped. Karen didn't even blink. "I know," she said, sounding entirely unbothered. "And I'm sure it's very useful for you, but I have to think about everyone else. We can't have safety hazards all over the place." James was about to lose it, but before he could say anything, Aiden spoke up. His voice was small but firm. "I'm not a hazard," Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sure you don't mean to be. But you have to understand, this park wasn't designed for extra accommodations. It's really unfair to expect the rest of us to adjust just because of your situation." James could feel his hands shaking. "Are you seriously telling my son he doesn't belong in a public park?" Karen threw up her hands. "I'm saying it's inconsiderate for you to bring something that takes up so much space when people are trying to enjoy themselves." By now, other people had started watching. Some looked horrified. A few whispered among themselves, but no one intervened. James took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Aiden has every right to be here." Karen's fake smile vanished. Her face hardened. "Then don't be surprised if people start complaining." James was about to fire back, but before he could, Karen reached into her purse. And then, everything happened at once. A burst of pain, a scream, a choked panic sob. Aiden was screaming, clutching his face, his small body jerking in his wheelchair. The acrid smell of pepper spray filled the air. For a split second, James didn't understand what had just happened. His brain refused to process it. Then, realization hit him like a freight train. Karen had pepper sprayed his son. James lunged forward, grabbing Aiden, his heart pounding as his son's cries tore through the park. "Oh my God, Aiden," he fumbled, trying to wipe at his son's face. His hands shaking as Aiden sobbed, his body writhing in pain. The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts. Someone screamed. Someone else yelled for help. People were moving, but James couldn't focus on any of it. His world had shrunk to Aiden's screams, his desperate attempts to soothe his son, to make the pain stop. Karen, meanwhile, took a step back, still holding the can of pepper spray. "He was in the way," she shrieked. "I felt threatened. He was obstructing public space." James snapped his head up, his vision swimming with rage. "You pepper sprayed a child," he roared. Karen's face was flushed, but she wasn't backing down. "I was defending myself. You people always think you can just do whatever you want. But there are rules. There are standards. We don't just let anyone ruin our community." James was on his feet before he knew it. His fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. If someone hadn't grabbed his arm, he might have lunged at her. "Dad!" Aiden sobbed, reaching for him blindly. That snapped him out of it. He turned back to his son, his heart breaking at the sight of him trembling, his face red and puffy, his tiny hands clutching at his eyes. "I need water. Someone, please." A neighbor finally stepped forward, handing him a bottle. Another woman had her phone out. "I'm calling the cops," she said, her voice shaking. Karen's face twisted in panic. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You're going to call the cops on me? I was protecting myself." James barely heard her. He was too busy trying to help his son. But as sirens wailed in the distance, he knew one thing for sure. Karen wasn't getting away with this. The police sirens wailed louder as they approached the park, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the horrified faces of onlookers. James could barely focus on anything but Aiden, who was still sobbing, his small hands clawing at his face, his body shaking violently from the pain. He had never seen his son like this before, so vulnerable, so utterly defenseless. His heart clenched as he poured water over Aiden's eyes, desperate to wash away the burning chemical that had been cruelly sprayed into his face. "Shoo, buddy. I got you. I got you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But Aiden was inconsolable, his screams cutting through the air like sirens of their own. Karen stood a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, her face contorted with self-righteous indignation. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't remorseful. If anything, she looked annoyed. Annoyed that people were reacting this way. Annoyed that James wasn't just backing down like she expected. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, rolling her eyes as the police vehicles came to a screeching halt. "This is ridiculous." The second the officers stepped out, multiple people rushed toward them. Witnesses were talking over each other, pointing at Karen, pointing at Aiden, their voices frantic. "She pepper-sprayed a little boy," someone shouted. "For no reason." Another woman was shaking, clutching her chest. "She just did it. She pulled it out and sprayed him like he was some kind of criminal." One of the officers, a tall man with sharp eyes, immediately focused on James, who was still crouched over his son. "Sir, what happened?" James barely had time to answer before Karen stepped forward, her voice laced with fake concern. "Oh, officer, thank God you're here," she said, placing a dramatic hand over her chest. "I was just trying to defend myself. This man and his son were creating a scene, blocking the pathways, and I felt threatened. I did what I had to do to protect myself." The words sent a bolt of rage through James. His head snapped up, and for the first time he wanted to completely lose control. "You pepper-sprayed my disabled child," he shouted, his voice cracking. He turned to the officers, gesturing wildly toward Aiden. "Look at him. He's 10 years old. What kind of monster does that?" Karen didn't even flinch. She was committed to her performance, shaking her head in exasperation. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she muttered. "People like this. Always causing trouble, always playing the victim. One of the officers narrowed his eyes. "Ma'am, I need you to step back." Karen gasped dramatically. "What? Are you seriously believing him over me?" She gestured toward James with disgust. "I'm a respected member of this community. I'm on the HOA board. I was enforcing the rules." At that moment, a woman stepped forward. One of the neighbors who had been recording everything on her phone. "Officer," she said, her voice shaking, "I have everything on video." She did it without provocation. Karen's head snapped toward the woman. "Excuse me?" The officer gestured for the woman to hand over the phone. As he played the video back, everyone grew silent. The footage showed everything. Karen storming up to them, her cruel words about Aiden obstructing the area, her complete lack of hesitation as she reached into her purse, pulled out the pepper spray, and sprayed a child in a wheelchair like he was nothing more than a nuisance. The officer's jaw tightened. Another officer, a female cop with dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, turned toward Karen with an unreadable expression. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assaulting a minor." The words shattered Karen's confidence in an instant. "What?" she gasped. "No, you can't arrest me. I was the victim here. This is harassment." The officers weren't listening. One of them pulled out handcuffs while another began reading her Miranda rights. Karen's screeching only grew louder. "I'm on the HOA board. I'm a law-abiding citizen. This is a miscarriage of justice." James didn't care. He didn't care about her protests, her entitlement, her dramatic meltdown. All he cared about was Aiden, who was still shaking, his face red and raw. He scooped his son up into his arms, holding him close as paramedics arrived. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick. "She's not going to hurt you again." The paramedics worked quickly, flushing Aiden's eyes, applying a cool cloth to his face, checking his breathing. "He'll be okay," one of them assured James. "It's painful but temporary. We should still take him to the hospital for further observation." James nodded. "Do whatever you have to do." Meanwhile, Karen was still shrieking as they dragged her toward the police car. "You people don't understand. This is my community. I make the rules. You can't do this to me." James finally stood, cradling Aiden in his arms. He turned toward Karen, meeting her wild, desperate eyes with a look of cold fury. "You don't own this community," he said. "You don't get to decide who belongs and who doesn't." Karen shook her head furiously. "This is all a mistake. It was self-defense. I was just enforcing the rules." James took a slow breath, then turned away. "Enjoy jail, Karen." The officers shoved her into the squad car, her shouts muffled as the door slammed shut. The fallout, the aftermath of the incident sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. News spread fast, and within hours, local media had picked up the story. HOA board member arrested for assaulting disabled child became the headline plastered across news websites and television broadcasts. People who had once supported Karen quickly distanced themselves, realizing just how deep her cruelty ran. The HOA, now under immense pressure, scrambled to cover themselves. But it was too late. James wasn't just going to let this go. He hired a lawyer. He pressed charges. He sued the HOA for allowing Karen to harass them for months without intervention. And he won. Karen not only lost her position on the HOA board, she lost everything. Her job, her social standing, her reputation. The court found her guilty of assault, and she was sentenced to jail time, community service, and hefty fines. But even beyond the legal consequences, her name became synonymous with cruelty and discrimination. She had spent years building an image of herself as an upstanding citizen, but in the end, her true nature had been exposed for the world to see. As for James and Aiden, they stayed. The community, shaken by what had happened, rallied around them. The same neighbors who had once turned a blind eye now actively worked to make the neighborhood more inclusive, pushing for better accessibility, removing Karen's absurd rules, and making it clear that Aiden was not just tolerated, he was welcomed. One afternoon, as James pushed Aiden through the park, the same park where everything had happened, his son looked up at him with a small smile. "She's really gone, huh?" James chuckled. She's really gone, buddy. Aiden nodded, a look of peace settling over him. Good. And for the first time in a long time, James felt it too. Things were finally right.